Okay, can everyone hear me? So I'm going to try to give my talk in about 30 seconds, and the rest of it will just be elaboration, because I'm not sure that I trust myself to come to everything I want to say in 15 minutes. So the outline is that I work on digital texts, digital Sanskrit texts. That's what Sarit is. I'll talk more about that later. It's a resource that makes texts in Sanskrit available, searchable, this type of thing. And we've been trying to build up these kinds of resources for several years using this factory model where we are aiming to produce a huge amount, thousands of pages of digital searchable texts. And that model has some limitations. And the main limitation is that it doesn't actually reflect what people who work with those texts do on a day-to-day basis, what their research is like, what their teaching is like. So that's much closer to the workshop model. So I'm going to use Sarit to exemplify the factory model, and then I'm going to use another project to exemplify the workshop model, and I'm going to try to pivot between them and think about how we should connect them. In other words, how we should build up resources for other people in the philological work that we do. I should also apologize for the somewhat manifesto-like tone that I'm going to take here, because I think that the problems that are real problems that need to be solved by us are practical problems. They're not technological, they're not theoretical. They are problems of how we actually make these resources and get people to use them. So I'm not going to be talking about things like XML encoding of particular textual issues. So I'll talk about the factory model first. So this is Sarit. When I joined this project in 2012, there was a lot of optimism about that was the right moment for launching a kind of large-scale infrastructure project for digital texts in Sanskrit. Why? Well, one, we thought that we had solved the encoding issue. And we don't have to worry about lots of different encoding schemes because we can take Unicode for granted. We also don't have to worry about formats because for most text projects, the TEI is an obvious choice. The Text Encoding Initiative is an obvious choice. And some other major issues like version control had also recently been given compelling solutions. So for Sarit, we actually have all of our texts on an online GitHub repository, which has very rich version control. So if we ever make changes to a single letter, those changes are documented, and we don't have to manually document those changes. And this project, what we hoped to produce, and what we did in fact produce in the period of the project, is number one, a set of guidelines for the best practices for encoding Sanskrit text in digital form. Number two, a critical mass of texts that exemplified those guidelines that could serve as models for other people and other projects, and this web-based platform for interacting with the Sarit text. Now, search and retrieval, we called it that, Dominic Vujastic called it that because he imagined that this would be the main thing that people do with digital texts. You want digital texts in the first place because you want to search them. You want to know whether a word occurs in them or not, what form it takes, what is its context, those kinds of questions, which are basic research questions for anyone doing textual studies. And I studied it in classics. People use resources like the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, and the Perseus Project every single day to do this basic philological research, and we just don't have anything like that in Indology. So we wanted to, this is a long-standing dream to create something like that. And but we're still quite far from this vision of a huge corpus of texts that we can use in the course of our regular research. So what's standing in the way? So this is the kind of production pipeline that we had. We would scan things, we'd send them off to India, they would be double keyboarded. Then we would add some type of TEI markup to them. And then we would put them on our version-controlled GitHub repository, and then they would be displayed on the website. And you can see a couple of sources of inertia in this pipeline. One is the medium. So we are, in Sarit, we were digitizing printed editions. And so when you're digitizing a printed edition, that's very different from digitizing a text, which means if an editor has chosen to use bold for two different things, you either have the choice of representing bold in your digital text, which means nothing, or you have to look at every single instance of bold face font and figure out what that means. And another limitation is script. With languages like Latin and Greek, words are separated by spaces in most of the editions. In Sanskrit, Kannada, lots of other Indic languages, that's not the case. We would like to be able to go from a kind of typescript of the characters of a text to a text that's analyzed into words, but it's impossible. I mean, we cannot do that automatically. We have to. It requires either reading or a pretty advanced machine learning tool that no one has developed yet. And then also attention. Sanskrit texts, not everyone can read them and work with them and provide the necessary annotation and commentary. And for the course of this project, there were just a few of us, so me and Ludmila Ollett, who also worked on the next project that will be presented. But there's a huge, huge mass of text in Sanskrit. And even if we provide tens of thousands of pages, which is to say, the Mahabharata or something like that, people will always want more because the range of stuff that's written in Sanskrit is vast. So there are ways around these limitations. So for instance, there's a great project called ctext.org. The person who runs that, he's OCR'd thousands and thousands of pages of classical Chinese texts. He's put them up, and then there's a kind of crowdsourced element to it where people will correct the OCR text. And he has hundreds of contributors. And these are people who read classical Chinese and make these changes. That's not going to happen for Sanskrit. I'm sorry. I think the real problem is that we're trying to produce a lot of text of a high quality, but the quality that we can reach on this model is never going to be high enough for philological research. And this is a huge problem. So we need to think about what philological research is, what it produces, and the kinds of needs that projects that are focused on texts have. So I'll speak very briefly about philology as a productive activity. I have a kind of long argument about this, but I'll just put up my definition, which is producing the totality of preconditions of an accurate and insightful understanding of the textual past. And I really emphasize producing because we need to bring things into existence that did not exist before. This is super important, and it contrasts with, I pick on my colleague at Chicago, Whitney Cox. His definition of philology is the public and methodical practice of virtuoso reading. And reading doesn't necessarily imply philological products. And so I'll just give you one example. A lot of people now are talking about Indian aesthetics. I think that that's great. That's because of Sheldon Pollock's book that came out last year. in which he translates the key texts on Indian aesthetics from Sanskrit. So this is a product, number one. That's based on another philological product, which is an edition that was produced between the 20s and the 50s by Ramakrishna Kavi. And then that was based on these Malayalam manuscripts, which are extremely difficult to read and painstaking. So there's a lot of work that goes into that, laying down the conditions for having a conversation. If anyone says anything about what Abhinavagupta in the 11th century thinks about aesthetic experience, that's because of this stuff right in front of us. And it's because of the work of Ramakrishna Kavi in particular. So I think that it's really important to remember that. And then what I want to say about the kind of pivot from the factory model or some other model of philological production to the workshop model is that there's three things that we should really keep in mind as we go about our own projects, whether they have to do with Hindi or Sanskrit or Kannada. If we're working on the pre-modern textual past, we want to respond to these three demands. And one is that we should consider to be products of our work some of the things that we in the past, or scholars in the past, have considered to be byproducts of our work. So I'll give you an example that I'll probably come back to. I'm working on a Kannada text, the Kaviraj Margam, or Way of the Poet King, with Sarah Pierce Taylor. And as we're reading this text, for every single verse, we analyze it. This is something that a lot of people do automatically. We split it up into words and we decide what those words are, what grammatical categories they belong to. And we had just been doing this for a while, and then we thought, maybe we should document this procedure. And that documentation, I think, is probably going to be the most useful thing that anyone takes out of our edition when we finally finish it. Now, why? I learned Kannada through this book, A Descriptive Grammar of Pampa Bharata. So there's no classical Kannada textbook that you can use. You just have to start reading and look up the words you don't recognize in this book. And it's because of this concordance that's contained in this book that I was able to acquire and build up some meager knowledge of classical Kannada grammar. And I think that we can do the same thing with our texts. In other words, if we are producing an edition, and if in the course of producing that edition, we are separating all of the words, we're saying this is a noun, this is a verb, et cetera, and linking those words to items in our glossary, then it will become a pedagogically useful text. But that's not all. Since I've been having nightmares for many years about the word analysis problem in Sanskrit, it's become clear to me that the only way that we're going to solve it is if we have huge parallel corpora. So we have unanalyzed text and analyzed text. You produce the analyzed text manually. You introduce all the word separations, and then you have some kind of machine learning algorithm to figure out how to break the text up into words. And I thought, now whenever I do something like this, I think, well, could we possibly leverage this for machine learning? Could a computer scientist do something with our data? And we want computer scientists to do something with our data. We want linguists to do something with our data. So we have this glossary of where we're tagging all the words. We're not linguists. We don't care to do that kind of work. But if you have a large corpus of Old Kannada verse that is grammatically analyzed, that's a really, really good starting point for any type of linguistic research. And so we want to make those things available as products of our research, not just byproducts. So the second point is turn those products, make them machine readable. And the basic point here, I think I don't have to belabor this, is that a lot of things are basically useless if they're not machine readable. So this comes from my book. I have an appendix of inscriptions, which is useful for reference purposes, I guess, but it's not really useful to anyone who's working on these inscriptions. You can't search through it. There's no facets. You want to have a database. So these inscriptions are, in a database now, and I think that that's a much better way to interact with this type of data in particular. So basically, the idea is that publishing something in print is acceptable if your output is your own scholarly prose. For basically everything else is a terrible way for things to end up. And then the last thing is services, build services for interacting with textual data. If I were giving this talk a couple of years ago, I would say build resources. But I think that resources are, it's a huge mistake now to make the accessibility of your data, your textual data, your bibliographic data, your prosopographic data, it's a huge mistake to tie that to one particular resource, to a website, to force people to go to your website to use that data and to learn how to use your website to interact with that data. I think that we need to find ways of making data available through services like APIs, and I'll give you, if that doesn't mean anything to you, then just forget it, but I'll give you one example. I'm teaching a first-year Sanskrit class this year, which is great. We read verses like this, and I kind of analyze the text into words for them, and then for each word, if you click on it, I have a live demo, but I'll skip that. You can go to the dictionary definition for each word, and it's because although these dictionaries weren't really designed with this type of programmatic interface in mind, we can still kind of reverse engineer them to give us the right entry. And something that was designed for a programmatic interface is this, the prakriya. So for each verb form, if you're not a Sanskritist, then close your eyes for about 30 seconds. For each verb form, you can go step by step through the rules of Sanskrit grammar to derive that form. And this is an interface that somebody has developed. And basically, my website just sends a request to his website, and what he sends back automatically is this list of steps. And then we can also link them to something that actually talks about Sanskrit grammar for each of the rules. So this is the type of, people talk about linked data. I mean, that's generally the direction we should be going in. In terms of linked data for South Asia studies, there's no, as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of explicitly engineered linked data resources available, but we can still link our data to each other. Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things about our Kaviraja Margam project, the Way of the Poet King. So this is I have a live demo here. So it's basically, we have our edition, our apparatus, parallels, translation notes. This is kind of what you would expect of an edition. These are the main outputs. We also have this glossary that I mentioned, which is generated from us doing this analysis, right? Oh, and this is funded by the NEH. I can't say I didn't say that. And the outputs we want to make available in some form that other people are going to use. So basically, most of the textual stuff is TEI. So we're hoping that people will take this TEI and do whatever they want with it. For the glossary and concordance, we have basic spreadsheets. I'll show you how this works in a second. And we want to publish all of this stuff, not in the sense of put it in a book, but publish it online so that people can access this data. And specifically for these secondary uses, teaching Kannada, to do corpus linguistics research, to do machine learning, to do OCR training. I don't know what the status of OCR for Kannada is, but it can't hurt to have these parallel corpora. I'll skip these. Things like, as I'm building the websites for these things, I think it'll be really nice to have better dictionary integration. It would be really nice to have bibliography integration. So you can click on Venkatachala Shastri 2003 page 40 and see what he says there. I mean, this is crazy, but we should be able to do that. Then I'll just show you a kind of, this is a basic example that you could potentially do this on your own. And I'm happy to help people do this on their own. And I think that it's only going to get done if the people who are actually doing the research are creating these resources and not relying on other people to create them for them. But so here's our list. It's a glossary. We have our lemmas. Sometimes there's references to a dictionary. And then in the TEI text of our edition, we've analyzed it so that each word is separated and it has these grammatical tags, and it's also linked to an entry in our glossary. And yeah, on the basis of that glossary and the edition, we automatically compile this word list, which serves as a concordance. It helps us keep track of our own translation decisions. And I'm hopeful that this will be really useful to people, and it's something that I definitely plan to do whenever I work on a text in this way. And I wish that more people would do it, because the basic idea is that we want the work that we do in the course of our individual projects or our group projects to feed into these larger resources in an intuitive way. And we don't know what the larger ecosystem of digital resources in South Asia studies is going to look like. For Kannada, there's really nothing out there, but we can make a start. So I'll stop there.